The Pine Creek School gymnasium smelled of a mixture of desperation and humanity. The air was heavy with the odor of wet clothes, strong coffee, and the metallic scent of rain. A generator hummed incessantly outside, powering the few lights that cast long, dancing shadows on the concrete block walls. Entire families were huddled on donated blankets. Children cried silently in their mothers' laps, and men with slumped shoulders and empty stares gazed into nothingness. It was a living portrait of abandonment. For Sarah, it was a cultural and sensory shock. Every face held a story of loss she could only begin to imagine. For the first time in her life, she felt like an intruder, a spectator to a pain that was not her own, wearing the remnants of clothes that were worth more than many of these people earned in a month. Ethan navigated the crowd with a quiet familiarity. He wasn't a leader, but he was one of them. People greeted him with a nod, a mutual acknowledgement of, "We're in this together." He found a slightly less chaotic corner near the retractable bleachers and helped Sarah sit down. "It's not much, but it's dry," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He disappeared for a moment and returned with 2 steaming styrofoam cups and a thin, rough Red Cross blanket. He handed a cup to her. The warmth emanating from the coffee was the first truly comforting thing Sarah had felt in hours, and her cold fingers clung to the styrofoam as if it were an anchor. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still hoarse. "Really, you saved my life." Ethan just shrugged, a gesture that seemed to deflect any form of heroism. "Anyone would have done the same," he replied, although they both knew that might not be true. He sat down beside her, not too close, but enough to share a small space of calm amidst the pandemonium. The silence stretched between them, filled by the sounds of the shelter. "Welcome to Pine Creek," Ethan said suddenly, with a hint of dark humor. "Normally we roll out the red carpet for visitors. Today, the mud is on the house." A small smile almost appeared on Sarah's face. It was enough to break the ice. "I'm Sarah," she said. "I know," he replied. "Your name was on a student ID floating in the car." "What's a big city photography student doing in the middle of nowhere during the worst flood of the century?" he asked, without any accusation, just genuine curiosity. Sarah felt a pang of shame. "It was a project," she explained, the words sounding futile and stupid now. About forgotten towns. The beauty in decay. Something like that." She saw a twitch in his face. His decay was her life. "There's nothing beautiful about this, Sarah. This is just what happens when you take everything from a place and leave nothing behind." He spoke of the Blackwood coal mine, the former soul of the town. He talked about how it had employed generations, including his father and himself, and how the company that owned it sold it to a larger conglomerate years ago. The new owners shut down the operation, took the profits, and left the infrastructure, including the old dam, to rot. He didn't speak with anger, but with the exhaustion of someone who had repeated this story hundreds of times. Sarah listened, each word dismantling the romanticized image she had in her head. This place wasn't a project. It was a graveyard of broken promises, and she was sitting next to one of its survivors. An unlikely connection born amidst the chaos. Stories like Ethan and Sarah's remind us of the strength of the human spirit. If you're moved by this journey, don't forget to leave a like to support us, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss a second of this unfolding story. Your support is crucial for us to continue bringing impactful narratives like this one. Now let's get back to the shelter. The conversation changed the air between them. Ethan's vulnerability in speaking of his town's open wound made Sarah, for the first time, see beyond the tragedy and see the man. She felt compelled to confess a bit of her own truth. perhaps to build a bridge over the chasm that separated them. "I understand what it's like to feel trapped," she said in a low voice, surprising herself. "My life, it might look perfect from the outside, but it's like a gilded cage. Every step is planned, every choice is a business strategy for my family. That's why photography is so important. It's the only thing that's just mine." Ethan looked at her, and the hardness in his eyes softened for an instant. He saw a trace of something familiar, the same search for freedom, even if the walls of their prisons were made of very different materials. This small confession opened a door. Ethan continued, his voice now lower, almost conspiratorial. "The problem is that the company that bought everything, the one that let the dam rot, they're smart. It's not a mining company with a dirty coal name. It's an investment fund with a clean name and an office in a skyscraper in New York. To them, Pine Creek isn't a community. It's an underperforming asset on a spreadsheet, a calculated risk they decided was worth taking." He shook his head, a bitter smile on his face. "They call themselves Sterling Global." The name hung in the air for a second before it hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Sterling, her mother's maiden name, the name she carried as her middle name. The styrofoam cup in her hands trembled, and a little cold coffee spilled onto her mud-stained pants. She didn't even feel it. The hum of the generator, the crying of children, everything faded away. There was only the sound of blood pounding in her ears and Ethan's gaze, which was now watching her with concerned curiosity. "Are you okay? You suddenly went pale." Sarah couldn't breathe properly. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried to swallow the lump that had formed in her throat, a lump made of guilt, shame, and a horrible, crushing irony. "Sterling," she finally managed to whisper, her voice a thread. "My name, it's Sarah Sterling. My father, he runs Sterling Global." If the first revelation had been a crack between them, this was an earthquake. The change in Ethan's face was instantaneous and brutal. The softness, the connection, the empathy. It all dissolved, replaced by a mask of ice. The hand that had pulled her from the water now looked like it could push her away. He jumped to his feet, the movement so abrupt it startled a nearby child. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw hatred in his eyes. This was not the man who had saved her. This was a stranger, an enemy. "You," he said, his voice low and laden with contempt. Of course it would be one of you." He turned and walked away, pushing through the crowd without looking back, leaving her alone in the middle of the gym, more lost and helpless than when she was sinking in her car. For Sarah, Ethan's retreat was like the floor opening up a second time. The noise of the gym, which had faded during their conversation, returned with full force, but now it sounded accusatory. Every murmur seemed to be about her, every sidelong glance a dagger of contempt. She shrank, wrapping the rough blanket around herself, no longer for warmth, but to try to disappear. She was the heiress to the empire that, in the eyes of these people, had allowed this tragedy to happen. The irony was sickening. She had come looking for a story about forgetfulness and discovered that her own family was the author of that narrative. The mud on her clothes now felt like a cheap costume, a pathetic attempt to blend into a reality that would never be hers. She wasn't a victim of the flood, she was part of the storm. On the other side of the gym, Ethan watched the rain lash against the high windows, his knuckles white from gripping the metal railing. The betrayal he felt was irrational, but overwhelming. He felt like an idiot. He had opened up to her, shared the raw pain of his community, and all along she was one of them. The image of her frightened face in the car mixed in his mind with the Sterling Global logo, a symbol of everything he despised, the cold corporate greed that saw people like him as mere collateral damage. The connection he had felt, the vulnerability they had shared, now seemed like a farce, a cruel trick of fate. He wanted to hate her completely, but the memory of her weight in his arms, the trembling of her body, complicated everything, turning his anger into a confused and bitter whirlwind. It was then that a new sound cut through the noise of the storm. A rhythmic and powerful sound that didn't belong in that place, the blades of a helicopter. The aircraft hovered over the soaked football field next to the school, its landing lights sweeping the gym like an interrogation spotlight. The shelter door opened and a middle-aged man entered, flanked by two assistants. He wore an expensive overcoat that the rain had barely dared to touch. His hair was grey and perfectly coiffed, and his face had the expression of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. He was Robert Sterling, and his gaze swept the scene with a mixture of impatience and disgust. He spotted Sarah and walked towards her, his Italian shoes treading carefully to avoid the puddles on the floor. "Sarah, thank God," he said, his voice controlled but the tension evident. He held her by the shoulders, inspecting her more like a valuable asset than a daughter. "We're getting you out of here." His eyes then met Ethan's, who was watching them from a distance. "Was it this man?" he asked Sarah. Before she could answer, he approached Ethan with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sir," he began, leaving the question hanging in the air. "I'm Robert Sterling. I appreciate you helping my daughter. My company would like to show our gratitude." He held out a business card. "Call my assistant. Tell him the value of your help and the damage to your boat. We will be generous." The offer hung in the air, reducing Ethan's act to a transaction, a service rendered. Ethan looked at the card, then at Robert Sterling's impassive face, and then at Sarah, who watched everything paralyzed. With a calm that was sharper than any scream, Ethan pushed the man's hand aside. "My help doesn't have a price," he said, his voice low and firm, "and this town is not for sale." That silent act of defiance was, for Sarah, louder than the storm outside. In that instant, she saw her father, the empire, and the gilded cage with clarity, and she knew she could never go back inside it. Ethan's challenge hung in the air, dense and unbreakable. Robert Sterling, a man who measured the world in figures and power, was momentarily speechless, shocked by the refusal of someone he considered insignificant. He turned to Sarah, the mask of control sliding back into place. "Sarah, that's enough of this experience. We're leaving, now." The order was final. The voice brooked no argument. It was the same voice that had guided her entire life. But for the first time, she didn't hear a father, but a CEO, and she made her choice. Instead of retreating towards her father and the promise of a clean, safe world, Sarah took a step forward, a small movement that aligned her with Ethan. She looked at her father, and the frightened young woman he had come to rescue was gone. In her place was a woman who had just found her backbone. "No," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm staying." Robert stared at her, incredulous. "Don't be ridiculous. You don't belong in this place." Sarah shook her head. "You're right. I didn't belong. But now, I can't leave. This isn't an underperforming asset, Dad. It's a town, it's homes, memories, lives that were destroyed because Sterling Global decided their safety was a risk worth taking." Her father's face hardened. Seeing the battle was lost and refusing to create a bigger scene, he took a step back. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," he said, cold as steel. Then he turned and left the gym without looking back. Minutes later, the sound of the helicopter flying away was like the final severing of an umbilical cord, leaving a heavy silence behind. Sarah now stood alone in the middle of her dilemma. Ethan still watched her, the anger in his eyes now replaced by a cautious confusion. She approached him, not with an apology, but with a declaration of purpose. "I can't erase who I am, Ethan, and I can't change my father," she began, her voice still trembling but filled with a new determination. "But I was wrong about my project. My camera, it shouldn't be here to capture beauty and decay. It should be here to document the strength, the resilience." She looked into his eyes, seeking not forgiveness, but understanding. "Let me tell your story. The real story. Let me show the world what was lost here, but more importantly, what refuses to die." She paused before adding, "I have a trust fund. Money that is mine. I want to use it to start a reconstruction fund, transparent, managed by you all. It's not charity. It's a start of justice." Ethan studied her for a long moment. He saw the sincerity in her tear-filled eyes and the strength in her posture. He saw that she was no longer the scared girl from the car, nor the arrogant heiress he had imagined. She was just Sarah. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "It's a start," he agreed, his voice hoarse. There was no hug, no promises of a romantic future, just a fragile understanding. In the weeks that followed, Sarah didn't leave. She became a constant presence, her camera capturing not misery, but the small acts of daily heroism. Neighbors sharing food, hands raising new walls, a smile amidst the wreckage. Ethan, leading a team of volunteers, would occasionally see her from a distance, focused on her work. And in their exchanged glances, there was a silent promise. Their love wasn't born from a rescue in the water, but was being built slowly in the difficult and muddy task of rebuilding a future that both, finally, chose to be a part of. So, what did you think of the conclusion to Ethan and Sarah's story? An intense journey about new beginnings and the power of our choices. If you were moved and believe more people should know this story, help us get this video out to a wider audience. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit the bell so you'll be the first to know when a new story arrives. And I really want to know where you're watching us from. Comment with your city below so I can give you a shout out in the next video. A big hug, and until the next story.